Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and now we go southeast of Cleveland to Pittsburgh, a beautiful city where we have a turn-of-the-century building, a castle that's actually a prison, another Art Deco building that's very beautiful and incredible, and the quintessential mystery building, the Cathedral of Learning, with its beauty. Come, let's begin our exploration. Greetings. Driving around the country, you always get a sense of freedom on the road, but the reality is you have to go where the road is going, and I always believed that driving was something that conveyed our freedom, and yet at the same time it doesn't. How old are these roads that we're driving on, and why is it so difficult to maintain them? History's a lot like jumping out of an airplane. You're reliant on the account that you're given, and your parachute may or may not work. What happens if you jump out of a plane, and you're going with your analogy of history, and you realize that perhaps that history you're given is incorrect, and it's sort of like getting your risers twisted up, and you're in a lot of trouble. We do all these reenactments, and it's amazing that we do these reenactments from the 18th and 19th century where we have no photos, and it gives us the impression that life was a particular way at that time. It reinforces that historical notion. The internet had an unforeseen side effect, though, of allowing independent researchers to correspond and share information, and it's allowed us to gain a new perspective of what may have happened in the past. We'll be told by everyone that the Industrial Revolution is responsible for our current civilization, and that's how we can build in the manner that we do. But if you accept that, you have to accept that the Romans managed to build the Pantheon in their roads before having such technology. That's what happens when you're strapped to the mainstream account. Well, we're going outside of the mainstream account, looking at Pittsburgh, which started as Fort Pitt, a military post that was constructed during the French Indian War in the mid-18th century. And we see a very beautiful star fort, and not just any star fort, but a complex star fort. I think it was John Levi who was discussing how civilizations were built on top of star forts, and I certainly agree with that theory, because we see a lot of evidence of how civilizations are built on top of star forts. And I speculate that the star fort builders were an earlier era. This is the blockhouse at Fort Pitt. This is the oldest extant structure of Pittsburgh, or so we're told. Pittsburgh, of course, being a strategic location at that time, as it was the confluence of these two rivers, creating the Ohio River, which we've seen many examples of cities on the Ohio River. We're going to be doing a subsequent exploration of the Ohio River and why civilization seemed to spark up along it. And here we see the Star Fort and the layout of the city, and it reminds us of Detroit. It seems as though this location was already very well planned out from its earliest days. And who knows what was really going on during the French and Indian War, or if it happened, as we're told it happened, and what years it took place in. That's the problem when we have our parachute that doesn't work. Pittsburgh, of course, was a victim of a fire in the 1840s, or so we're told, and like many other cities, it has its fire, and these are the pictures of it. And we're told that the reason this happened is because the city grew too fast, and they didn't have proper implements in place to battle fires. Yes. No one ever seemed to learn that lesson, though, throughout the entire 19th century and even into the early 20th century. Or once again, maybe Sherman's army was just a little confused. And I use that joke a lot, yet it's amazing to me how many northern cities were destroyed by fire. Here's a rendering of the aftermath of this fire, and it completely destroyed the city. And yet, for some reason, it didn't stop the good people of Pittsburgh and those very resilient settlers, whoever they really were, from rebuilding again. Now, did this fire actually happen, as we're told, or is this a representation of a different event that occurred and wiped out the previous civilization and its structures? It seems to be a more likely explanation, especially given the recurring evidence that we see. And here we have a later depiction of Pittsburgh, supposedly from the 1870s, and we see a very built-out city with many beautiful bridges going across the multiple rivers and the start of the Ohio River. Very beautiful and a lot of detail that we see, as though many of these structures were already in existence. And remember that this photo, or should I say this rendering, is after the fire occurred. Yet very beautiful, well-built-out buildings, amazing towers, churches, and it already seems as though they've got industry starting, and Pittsburgh is known for being the steel center of the United States. And there were many great strikes that were involved with that steel empire, along with the great individual Andrew Carnegie. I still find it comical that somebody thinks that I was a great admirer of Andrew Carnegie. It's a joke, but I have to keep running back to the joke because, yes, Andrew Carnegie was a great individual, and he was the original philanthropist in the early 20th century, and that's why we have so many wonderful libraries, thousands, that are named after him. Apparently, the results of his steel empire, though, were massive riots, and yet there were more fires and more buildings were destroyed in Pittsburgh in the 1870s. Here's the Union Station that was destroyed, and subsequently they had to build it, with help from the great architect from the Chicago World's Fair, no less. We'll take a look at that a little later. But yes, 2 fires, a lot of strife, and yet at the same time, the history for Pittsburgh, once again, is very vague when you go from its original establishment as a modest military fort, a star fort no less, in the 1750s, to the 1860s. It's a similar story with just about every American city. The history is very vague and seems to be hand-waved until you get to about the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s. Here's another rendering of Pittsburgh in 1902, and once again we see more build-out. Yet at the same time, it doesn't seem to have gone much further than the earlier image we saw from the mid-19th century. So early 20th century, and seeing all the traffic on the river, the beautiful bridges, and the incredible buildings. People always try to convince me that we had greater technological capability at the start of the 20th century. And I'm not going to take a PBS special as evidence for that, because you're watching video of photos which may or may not prove something, or they may simply be trying to give you a preconceived notion, because it's a lot easier to convince people to believe things, and then people have a difficult time letting go of things that they already believe, even when there's evidence that runs contrary to that. And here we see this early 20th century of Pittsburgh, with the industry being started up, and there's some very incredible and beautiful buildings in this early 20th century image. We see things that give us the inclination that these buildings were here for a long time, and therefore it counters the historical account we're given that all this was built in the early 20th century. Look at this particular building with the arches and the water tower on the top, and what appears to be very difficult masonry construction. Construction that we don't do today, and we're told because it's prohibitively expensive, and it's just a lot more efficient to run our very cheap brutalist architecture or our postmodern architecture. Yet when you look at these buildings, you see examples of something that were built to last. Something that did last until we tore them down as part of our so-called urban renewal in the mid-20th century in the United States. Even in the early 20th century, you can see the beauty of Pittsburgh in the distant skyline. Look, a couple onion tops over there. Yes, very easy things to construct, and these had to have been constructed in the 19th century, if we go with the historical account. So again, we have many more questions and few answers, and we see a lot of contradictions within these images. And now we go to the early 20th century of Pittsburgh, and looking at a panoramic shot of the city, and we see very well built out buildings, we see the amazing, beautiful bridges. You get the impression that there's just so much infrastructure that was already existing within this city. And you see this with all these very tall and beautiful buildings that they had the capability to build right in the early 1900s. So in other words, they were building with 19th century technology or 1800s technology in the early 1900s. Again, another point that we seem to gloss over. But that's all right. The Second Industrial Revolution happened, and there were plenty of people who were just coming to the United States en masse, and that is what the historical account tells us. And it doesn't matter that they spoke different languages or had different backgrounds. They were able to work together very quickly and rapidly and achieved a unifying purpose. It's the American dream. Now we go a little later in Pittsburgh's history, 1920s, 1930s, and we see how built out the major industry is. Yet at the same time, we still see many of the older structures there. And we get the impression that this city seems to have been augmented a little bit, and yet we can't help but question that the core infrastructure was already there. Yet it's very easy to obfuscate the historical account because who knows when these photos were taken, and this is something else that I bring up. Not only could photos have been subjected to manipulation, but you can just put a date on a photo and you can say a photo's from any date. Think if this photo was actually from the year we think of 1840. This is the very first City Hall building in Pittsburgh, and we're told this was the original one that was built right after the Revolutionary War, or in the 1790s, and it served until the mid-19th century. This doesn't even look like a modest building. This looks like something that we wouldn't even build today, because it's prohibitively expensive, and why do we need that? We can use our beautiful postmodern architecture. Here's the second City Hall from the mid-19th century. Yeah, it's a very beautiful building, and I could see why they would have to tear that down, because they did. It just wasn't suitable for their purposes of running city administration. Pittsburgh was growing really quickly. See the really beautiful building behind it. Lovely clock tower and detailed architecture, which looks like masonry. Yes, of course, this is not a building that we would need. We need a nicer city hall. And this is what they did from 1915 to 1917, the third and current City Hall. And you see yet another beautiful, impressive building built during World War I, or so we're told, with columns that they managed to lift up to a third floor, beautiful large arches, and very solid masonry construction. And you see it's next to the county courthouse, the Allegheny County Courthouse we'll look at later. This is the interior of the City Hall, and look at this incredible beauty. Now we have pillars and columns on the inside, and it looks like either granite, marble, or limestone walls. Hard to tell. I would need to examine in person. And you see that beautiful window there at the end. Yes, of course, those are the very fine things that you need to put effort into constructing in the early 20th century to run a proper city administration. Here's a black and white photo of some of the other solid masonry construction on the inside. Yes, I'd almost call this perhaps Empire Strikes Back architecture style. Although there's really no building in Empire Strikes Back, it's a bit of a joke in the fact that it's the only Star Wars movie that didn't have to rely on a superweapon, and yet it's considered to be the best Star Wars building, or Star Wars movie. The Arrott building in 1902. So yes, we'll start with this beautiful building before the Art Deco era, and yet it matches the beauty of any Art Deco building, and I would even dare say exceeds it. And of course we have the columns that are lifted up. Looks like it's up on the 4th or the 5th floor, because why not? Very easy thing to do at the start of the 20th century. And here's the plaque that we have on it, completed in 1902. Earliest skyscrapers, of course, unique lobby of marble and mosaic tile and richly molded bronze, because why not? Granite, brick, and lavishly formed terracotta. Ah, yes, that's what they called them. The terracotta buildings were the ones that came before Art Deco. And we have our architect, Frederick John Osterling, who's credited with this incredible, beautiful building, and it still stands today. It's very interesting that we have designations for certain buildings like this, and the presence of this building on the timeline that we're given has a lot of inconsistencies, especially when we consider the fact that a building like the Arrott building, and here it is in the very middle of this photo, it rivals anything that we have today that survives from the Art Deco era, and it certainly exceeds all of our modern or postmodern buildings. And why is that? Because of the beauty and the detail, not just in the exterior, but in the interior. We don't build buildings like this today, and all we have for this are excuses. Well, we have safety standards, we have OSHA, we have financial limitations. I always laugh at the financial limitations because we're always raising the debt ceiling. Here's a beautiful front of the Arrott building, and you see the archway and the masonry construction, and again just some of the detail in terracotta construction. As though somebody just had the ability to laden this building with beautiful decorations and they had no timeline. And then look at this. Here you have the columns that are lifted towards the near top of the building. And, you know, you'd traditionally call the roof parapets, but this looks like very decorative parapets. I would argue that this matches and exceeds the so-called Art Deco era, and yet this was done 20 years before the Art Deco era on the timeline that we're given. Very incredibly beautiful building, and there's nothing we could do like this today. And don't tell me that any of these buildings that we build today that are taller, that are just glass and steel and very plain, matches this, because in my humble opinion, they do not. This is a beautiful building that exceeds a lot of the capabilities that we have today, and it's just another one of those inconsistencies that will be told there's a slew of reasons. And when someone has to try to justify something by doing intellectual cheetah flips, you realize that it's probably not the truth. And here's an older photo of the entryway, and you see the same beautiful decoration. Look at that. They even have the scaled columns next to the arched doorway. You're really nobody in Pittsburgh in the early 20th century unless you have a very big door. And I have to appreciate this very big door. Here's the interior. Yes, a very modest early 20th century construction, and certainly the beauty you will not see in the interior of any of our postmodern buildings that we build today. Because why would you? It's prohibitively expensive. I like the checkerboard floor, and I wonder if that's marble or granite. This is definitely a building I would like to get inside of. I had a lot of difficulty getting inside of Rochester, Minnesota's one Art Deco building, and I'm not sure why. I suppose if I claimed to be a scholar, I could have gotten in for a tour. But this one just, again, shocks me with its beauty. And just look at this. All this kind of detail, all this construction, done within a year in the early 20th century. Well, I saw a PBS special that showed me that this would have been easy to do. Right. And Ken Burns also very convincingly showed us the Civil War. Oh, here's the entryway to the Arrott building. And, of course, beautiful, it looks like marble walls above the elevators. You know, you need to have that kind of marble detail. Once again, I'm reminded of the many state capitals that I've been in and the banisters there that are made of fine marble, such as the Iowa State Capitol. And here you see it again, because you need to have edging on the walls that show that. Just incredible beauty, and a building that when you walk inside, it inspires you. It inspires you at the deepest levels. And there's a reason why I'm focusing on this building, because supposedly this was built at the very start of the 20th century with the best of 19th century technology. And you even see it in the ceiling, the chandelier, no detail spared, all within a year, and justified by the fact that there were no safety standards. There was infinite money available in the early 20th century, although we're told there were financial panics. And now we go on to the Gulf Tower, our Art Deco building, built in 2 years, 1930 to 1932. So it seems that in Pittsburgh, they needed 2 years as opposed to 1 in Cleveland to build their Art Deco buildings. Maybe it's just because they put a little bit more effort into it, or maybe they were trying to be a little bit more realistic with the timeline they were given on building these Art Deco buildings. And here's the top of the Gulf Tower, and so we see sort of a step pyramid structure, and then there's this beautiful obelisk, or hard to describe it on the top, but very beautiful. And I'm reminded of all the other Art Deco buildings that we've seen. They spare no expense on the detail, it seems, because once again, infinite funds during the Great Depression. There was no problem in 1930 to 1932 in the United States, just this thing called the Great Depression. But again, I'll quote other explorers. They say it was a Great Depression that really was great, because it seems incredible achievements somehow occurred across the United States, whether it was with the WPA or just with private contractors still completing amazing construction. Here's the entryway to the Gulf building, or Gulf Tower. Gorgeous and beautiful. And you won't see entryways on modern buildings like this today. I think of the 801 Grand building from Des Moines, Iowa, which they supposedly built the late 1980s in 2 years, and no, nothing on that matches this. Yes, they try to give you the impression that they can. Here's the entryway. Bit more time, and they were able to use that time, I suppose, instead of just doing it in 1 year like they did with Terminal Tower in Cleveland. So who's to say what's really going on? And of course we have our beautiful elevator room, because you need to adorn the elevator room. Look at those very beautiful pillars that are built right into the wall. Now, is that marble? Is that granite? It's so shiny and beautiful, and once again it inspires the imagination. Somehow these buildings speak to us internally. And now we go to Koppers Tower, built 1927 and 1929, another Art Deco building, another 2-year wonder, because even building these buildings in 2 years with their beautifully decorated interiors, which I think tells the real story, is something that's a bit of a slap in the face with the historical account that we're given. I'm not going to say it's a narrative anymore, but yes, someone's trying to push narrative points. And again, you see the same exterior beauty on the Koppers Tower here, as though it's almost a step pyramid building. And we don't really build buildings like this now. You have these incredibly beautiful glass and steel towers that go to the sky, but for whatever reason they just seem very plain, and they don't match this. So a second Art Deco building in Pittsburgh, and here it is with the Gulf Tower, and you see that both these buildings stand out in an amazing fashion on the skyline. There's nothing that really matches them, and I'm thinking about how it's almost as though these buildings are concealed by the new modern glass and steel towers that we build. And I also think of how I noticed this with the single Art Deco building in Rochester, Minnesota, the Plummer Building, how it was surrounded by the new buildings of the Mayo Clinic, the glass and steel towers that look like places that you're going to be sent in for purgatory. Maybe I'm going a little bit far with that analogy, but it seems to be quite appropriate when you see the unyielding beauty of these Art Deco buildings. And every time I see them inside and outside, you feel inspired. We have construction photos, supposedly, of the Koppers Tower, and this is supposedly the foundation. Make of this photo what you will. You can certainly analyze it on your own, and you can ask your own questions about it. Maybe to many people, this would be good enough to prove that, yes, we did construct this building. And somebody constructed this building. I love this one. A picture of a picture showing the construction of the building. The only thing I think that would make this more convincing to me if this was video of a picture of a picture. Now, granted, you're watching video of a picture of a picture, but don't let that cause you to question anything that you see. In my real estimation, it's important that we question everything we see. And of course, we have the same beautiful entryway to the Koppers building, because why not? 2 years, so, once again, Pittsburgh's being a little bit more realistic with their construction timeline. They have to be. And I think the whole point behind that is it seems as though different cities, we're supposed to believe, had different capabilities with how fast they could build these Art Deco buildings. Yes, the elevator bank, once again, with the very beautiful walls, the beautiful doors, all the decorative detail that you could do in 2 years, or 1 year, depending what location your Art Deco building was in. I don't know. The more I see this, the more I'm amazed by the fact that they try to push this historical account. Because when you start to look at this over and over again, and here you see it in the entryway, just gorgeous beauty and detail, and nothing that our modern buildings will match. And we've been over the array of excuses that were given, or reasons that were given. OSHA stops everything. Yes, of course it does. Isn't it fascinating, though, what we can still accomplish even with OSHA? We can still supposedly build incredible jets and planes. Now imagine yourself taking a drive down Allegheny Mountain, and you're going into this beautiful tunnel here. This tunnel here is quite amazing. And yet suddenly you find yourself driving right into the prison. Yes, the Allegheny Prison. It's part of the Allegheny Courthouse. And here's the Allegheny Courthouse, or the old Allegheny Courthouse, built 1883 to 1888. I call this Grayskull Revival architecture style, because it reminds me of Castle Grayskull, and I'm talking from the original He-Man, the 1980s cartoon. What exactly else would you call this architectural style? Very beautiful tower and very large masonry construction, because that's how you built courthouses. Well, the architect was Henry Hobson Richardson. He lived 1838 to 1886, but for some reason there's not a photograph available of him. So maybe he just wasn't photogenic, or maybe he preferred a painting because, it could be a little bit more flattering. And we see the same hallmarks. There's something about this, though, that reminds me of Union Station in St. Louis, with the beautiful and tall clock tower and all the details in masonry construction. I even like the fact that they have a little smokestack over there. So what was the original intention and purpose behind this building? Well, it had to replace this courthouse that was ruined by fire in 1882. And you see, this is no slouch, with the pediment, the columns, and the beautiful dome. But I guess this was a dome talking about the justice system, not democracy, as we like to call it, because you don't know you have democracy without a dome. Apparently, the old Allegheny Courthouse is a wedding venue. And I always think that's an indicator that you're seeing a beautiful old world building, because there's no way your spouse is going to want to get married in one of these brand new buildings, or one of these new municipal buildings with their very block-like, uninspired construction. But this, with its very beautiful tall tower, which of course people tried to explain to me that everybody needed to see the clock. Well, this was built in the latter half of the 19th century, when everybody should have had a pocket watch. But, I guess you need a tall tower so you can see the building. I suppose that makes sense. And here's a very telling photo where you have everybody parking their horse and buggy next to the tower. Yes, those horses and those buggies could carry those large masonry blocks there. Well, they had other means of doing it, and they just worked harder, and people had to work harder, they starved and they died. Yes, if you want to believe that, be my guest. Very beautiful building. And even in these older photos, you see all these towers, which I think are quite telling, which causes us to ask a lot of questions, especially when you see the smokestack next to the very tall tower. They had no problem building buildings back in that time that could go to the sky. We're given the impression that we can build taller buildings today, and that may be true. I love this fountain, too, that's out in front of this building, because as a municipal administrative building, this gives you a completely different impression, a completely different vibe. And here's one of the wedding photos that you see, and you could see why somebody would want to get married here in these beautiful arches with these scaled columns and stairs. This really feels like a beautiful fairy tale building. This doesn't feel like your boring administrative municipal building that you're going to go in for any reason. And here's another photo of the interior of the courthouse. Just incredible beauty. This is the old saying goes, if you get married in an old world building and then get divorced in a postmodern building where you're going to be in for 2 years for court proceedings. But don't worry, your lawyer has your best interest at heart, and the state certainly has your best interest at heart. And now we go to the Allegheny County Jail. Yes, the Castle Grayskull building, which, the courthouse is also part of it. This is a very beautiful masonry construction, and I've got to say, this is a very secure prison. No one's getting in or out of this. But was this originally constructed to be a prison? Of course, we have our large towers on the end of it that will say, yes, of course, it was constructed to be a prison. Yet, I can't help but speculate on a different function for this building, especially with all the towers. Why do you need those smaller towers for a prison? Look, just don't question it. Look at the inside of it. You even have a large column within the prison complex itself. Now, I suppose that these cells have more of a prison function to them, but when you look at the walls and the supporting structure, it doesn't seem that way. On to the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad Station, an 1898 building. And while this may seem more of a modest block construction on the outside, we can see the usual old world details, especially towards the roof and in some of the windows. But once again, this is yet another building where the real story is on the inside. And here you see it with this beautiful ceiling with the large arch, the sun window, and of course you see the typical columns that were brought on the inside. And it's now a restaurant. Kind of reminds me of the Marble Room in Cleveland. I think this is another location I'm going to have to go and have dinner in. Just incredible beauty. Why do you need that for a railroad station? It is gorgeous. The columns, the arched ceiling, the stairs even, and the floor. And look at that, we see a familiar symbol in the floor. And the Union Trust Building, 1915 to 1916. And this definitely gives an old world feeling to it, especially with the roof and on top of the roof was some of the adornments and the decorations because, there was no problem to do those things in the early 20th century during the World War I time frame. There was nothing else going on at that time. The United States was very vibrant, and even though we were told that there were panics in the early 20th century, and that's why we needed to establish the Federal Reserve so we could establish a monetary supply and control over it. Look at the beauty on the roof. And each of these little towers that protrude from the roof. And this is the inside of this building. This is incredible. The way these rotunda floors go all the way up to the top to what looks to be a skylight. Incredible beauty, and again, something we see from the old world where we're always looking up and we always see beautiful natural light that almost feels otherworldly every time we observe it. And I think that's one of the most telling aspects of these old world buildings. This is just gorgeous, and this is, again, not something you're going to see that's done in our postmodern buildings, because why would anybody want to see any kind of natural light? You've got the best artificial lighting, fluorescent lights are very beautiful, and we need them in all our buildings. And here's another gorgeous entryway. Every little detail, to the handrails, to even the shapes beneath the banister on the handrail, it is unbelievably beautiful. And multiple floors and wide images that you have because these rooms are a lot larger. Union Station, 1898 to 1904. Yes, of course, every city has its own Union Station, and Pittsburgh is no exception. And you can see the very large masonry construction. And you might recall that Union Station, the original Union Station in Pittsburgh, was burned down during those strikes because Andrew Carnegie was such a nice guy. Well, apparently he wasn't nice enough. This was the architect, Daniel Burnham, who was of the Chicago World's Fair fame. Very interesting individual, and we do actually have a picture of him. And yes, I could certainly see him as being an individual who could design hundreds of buildings and was just an out-and-out genius. Look at this photo. Even in the background, you see a lot of things that cause question. Another large smokestack, the beautiful masonry architecture. We'll take a closer look at the dome, which is one of the most unique features of Pittsburgh's Union Station. And here's an overall photo of it, and again, the size and immensity of these Union Stations. And of course, there is the large shed for the trains, because apparently that was easy to do at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century as well. Because, we had infinite labor, there was no OSHA, we had infinite money, there were artisans and immigrants everywhere. And here's the interior of that dome, and this is one of the most beautiful and otherworldly structures I think I've ever seen. What exactly is the purpose of this? How do they even try to justify this within the account that we're given? And you see detail that rivals anything from a science fiction or a fantasy movie with some of the beautiful architecture there. And look at how it's lit up in the evening. This is truly otherworldly, and I don't think there's any simple explanation for these arches and this dome and the way this was even put together. Just an incredibly beautiful building, and then of course you even have the brick on the roadway or sidewalk that runs under it. And now the Cathedral of Learning, built 1921 to 1926, and I believe one of the most impressive structures in Pittsburgh. Just an incredibly beautiful building. And you have to wonder, do people appreciate this building when they see it, when they walk along and in front of it? How many people go about their studies every day in this building and don't even realize what's all around them? And I'm guilty of that myself. I studied and worked in plenty of gorgeous old world buildings, and I didn't appreciate it. I didn't understand what was so majestic about a building like the Cathedral of Learning. Look at the large cavern room areas. I mean, this truly is a cathedral on the inside. And yet, when we look at the construction photos, we'll see that they don't seem to match up with these rooms that we see. And this is one of the so-called national rooms. At least that's what the account that I've read has told me. I need to get on the ground a little closer and examine the inside of the Cathedral of Learning. And hopefully it has access, especially if it really is a Cathedral of Learning. Here's our construction photo that we have of it. And once again, you see the usual hallmarks of the construction photos that were given. This doesn't match up to the large cavern rooms that we saw, but supposedly this is the first floor on top of the foundation being constructed in this photo. Yes. Well, again, come to your own conclusions, and you see they made a little bit more progress on it. Now, does this really match the photos that we just saw of the beautiful interior of the Cathedral of Learning? I don't know. It's just that when you see the construction photos, it always seems to generate far more questions than answers. And, it almost seems like they're building a modern skyscraper with these construction photos. Yet the building that we just saw and the interior photos we looked at, this is nothing like a modern skyscraper whatsoever. This is something that resembles the great and beautiful cathedrals of Europe. And we're told that the great and beautiful cathedrals of Europe were built before the Industrial Revolution. This is a really strange photo because it almost looks like the scaffolding is on the outside of what they're building for the building. But again, come to your own conclusions. And maybe these photos are enough to convince you that, yes, this building was easily built in the early 20th century and it was no issue whatsoever. What a gorgeous building. And when you look at it from this vantage point, you see how beautiful it is, especially with the natural lighting. And at the same time, you can see the different appearances of the masonry construction. This is really a building that you just have to ask, how exactly did they do that? And those construction photos don't really seem to give me any sort of reinforcing notion that we really know the answer to that question. There's just something that feels a little off about them. Yet there's nothing that feels off when you actually look at this building and the fact that it is there. This is a building you can go to today and appreciate the beauty of its construction. And in my humble estimation, it's the fact that these buildings can be interfaced with physically. And here we see the interior photo. Now, does this interior photo really match the construction photo we saw earlier? Again, I leave it to you. Beautiful arches and just a large cavern of a room. And how much interior cubic space do you really have in this room? That's another interesting question. Just the ability to spread out. And look at that giant chair there, almost like a giant throne. This is really a building I want to get inside and take a look at with all the details and see this firsthand. Just gorgeous and beautiful beyond the ability of words to describe, and this is something that matches any cathedral across Europe that was supposedly built hundreds of years earlier, or built over a period of hundreds of years, such as Cologne Cathedral. Look at these beautiful arches and these large masonry blocks that were used to construct this. 5 years, 1921 to 1926. We have really declined in capability, and even if you go with the mainstream account as to how this building was built with its timeline, how do you justify that? Here's one of the national rooms, because of course you need a very beautiful dragon that we would say is inspired by East Asian culture. And here's another one of these national rooms, and just throwing in these scaled columns was no issue whatsoever. And people say, well, they could construct bricks back then. Well, there's a lot of bricks that go into that, and a lot of bricks that go into all the great old world structures that you see across the United States. Here's the entryway to the Cathedral of Learning, and you see once again large blocks, beautiful ornate detail, as though it was no challenge whatsoever to provide the people whatever detail they wanted in a building. But don't worry, today you can get yourself a nice big tall glass and steel tower that has absolutely no features on it. And I go back to the original exploration of St. Coletta in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, and this very large edifice, which is still standing today and is something else that you can interface with to prove to you that there is a very large building in a place where it really doesn't make any sense for it to be. Now, if you just take every historical account at face value, then this is good enough for you. In any event, what did you think of the exploration of Pittsburgh? Thanks for joining me.